Katie, thank you very much. I need to offer a personal note first, and that was when my wife and I first moved here. I'm almost reluctant to say it was back in 1977, that long ago. I'd like to say I was 10 years old then, but you know better than that. That we lived for several months in an apartment in the Bellevue area, and the very first church that we attended Mass at was right there at St. Louis. So it's really good to make that connection with all of you again. I wish we could be together, but we're together in virtual space. Uh, I will just mention that, oops, I need to reestablish Keynote here because that's not showing up. Let me go ahead and, okay, no, why is that not? Should, now that should be ready. And I just need to go back to, why don't we go, okay, we're recording. What I'm going to do now is go ahead and pull up my presentation for you that I hope will add some add a dimension to all of this for you. So we need to just go ahead and activate that and slide that down. There we go. So again, my thanks for the invitation to come and speak to all of you. And we are going to begin our program with a virtual visit to Assisi, Italy. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually all go there together? I'd like to begin by greeting you with buongiorno, hello, or good day in Italian. And I begin that way because in a very real sense, Laudato Si, the encyclical, has its roots in Assisi, Italy. And of course, that's also the hometown of St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of ecology. This statue of St. Francis, one of my favorites when we had a chance to visit that area some years back, overlooks the valley just below Assisi. Now, I think there was very little in Francis's early life to suggest that he'd become a saint. He was known as the life of the party in Assisi. He sought greater prestige and influence by becoming a knight, by riding into battle against neighboring Perugia. The campaign was, I think it's fair to say, a disaster. Francis saw many of his comrades killed. He himself was taken captive and became very, very sick in prison. Now, at length, the Perusians finally accepted a ransom offer from his father, Pietro. Francis returned home, but he spent very little time there. He spent most of his time wandering around the hills. I think it's fair to say that he was broken not only in health, but also in spirit. Some of his key assumptions, some of the things that were important to him, he realized were no longer very important, no longer had value for him. And he had that sense that he was being called in a different direction. Now, one day he walked into a crumbling little church called San Damiano, where he encountered this crucifix. And he told his friends that he didn't hear in his imagination or just inside his head. He heard literally with his ears the figure of Jesus on the crucifix say to him, "Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling into disrepair." Now, Francis was a young man. He thought very literally. So he ran to the Assisi version of an Ace Hardware, no, they didn't really have one, and began to get building supplies together to repair that church. Now, there's no question that the structure of San Damiano was crumbling. But I think in time, and Francis was influenced by the pastor of that little church, that he needed to broaden his vision. He needed to recognize it wasn't the church building that he was called to repair. It was the larger house, the collection of the faithful, their relationship to God, their fidelity to living a life informed and modeled after the gospel. We are called by Laudato Si to repair God's house, our home, for the ecosystems that are the foundation and the structure of life on this planet are indeed also crumbling. It calls us to view creation not merely as a collection of objects, but as a communion of subjects, all originating from God. As St. Francis modeled in his encounter with the Wolf of Gubbio, we are called to recognize and reconstruct that basic communion from a manipulative or managerial relationship to a collaborative relationship called the theology of a community of creation. And that brings us to consider what we are facing. I like to call them the climate flashpoints of this year. These are not easy to understand or to accept. I liken it to being faced with the foods we least liked as a child. For me, it would have been easy. It would have been beets. For you, it might have been Brussels sprouts or spinach or broccoli. But we need to think of what our moms would have told us, and that is that this is good for us, this information, even though it pains us at the time being. So take a second or two and stop to think of what examples of impacts on our climate, impacts on our environment have been especially troubling to you. Let's just take a couple of seconds. So now what I'd like to do is join me, we'll talk about yours, on what I consider the major climate flashpoints, specifically record polar heat, record mid-latitude heat, record tropical heat, record drought, record wildfires, record ice melt, and record global carbon dioxide. So let's begin with the first of these, but looking instead at a quote from Laudato Si. The external deserts are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. I think it's fair to say that this speaks to the issue of self-absorption, of distancing ourselves from the environment, and focusing more on economic issues than on issues that will impact both the economy, but also our ability to inhabit this planet, not only now, but also for years to come. So let's begin by looking at the first of the climate flashpoints, polar heat. Antarctica had record heat in the early part of February 5th through 13th. Two different locations on the Antarctic Peninsula had temperatures in the mid to upper 60s, about the same of what Los Angeles was experiencing at that time. And it bears mentioning that the typical high temperatures for Antarctica during their summer would be in the 50s, not the 60s, much less approaching 70. If we move to the other end of the globe, to the Arctic, to the little Siberian town of Verkhoyansk, June 20th, 2020, they recorded a temperature of 100 degrees. It not only was record heat, but led to record wildfires. Our flashpoint number two is mid-latitude heat. The warmest summer on record this year over the northern hemisphere. The mid-latitudes, by the way, 30 to 60 degrees north and south latitude, the zones where we live here in the Seattle area. There are numerous examples of how this played out. Death Valley possibly setting a planetary record of 130 degrees. Europe, multiple 100-degree plus days. Major cities in the Middle East, 120. China had its first heat warning issued ever. Beijing recorded 109 degrees. Flashpoint number three, record tropical heat and record heat in the ocean. Now, ocean temperatures we know have long been increasing. You can see the orange and red extending along the equatorial region. What's significant is it's getting deeper, as deep as 6,600 feet. We're seeing this reflected, and farther north and farther south. Now, all this heat is why we're seeing tropical storms and hurricanes form much earlier than is usual. Just one example of that, Tropical Storm Arthur, which formed 2 weeks before the start of the official Atlantic hurricane season on May 16th, 2020. Areas affected by drought are now also increasing globally. The number of areas impacted by drought have doubled over the last 40 years. That's incredible. Mega droughts are what we're now seeing in the United States. It's said that we're entering a mega drought. In fact, based on data collected by scientists at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and published in the prestigious journal Science, it shows we've been in it 20 years. It's continuing to deepen, and based on their analysis, we're likely to stay in that mega drought, or it's likely to be the worst mega drought in 1,200 years. Flashpoint number five. And if I were to lay money on it, I would bet that when I asked you about climate flashpoints, when I was trying to regain my throat and my voice, I bet you probably thought of wildfires. All Western states were fighting wildfires this summer. 6+ million acres, almost 7 million acres burned in Washington, Oregon, and California. There have now been 43 confirmed deaths, the worst air quality on the planet. In fact, health officials say that the air we breathed was equivalent to smoking 25 cigarettes each and every day. Not just adult smokers, but children, infants, the elderly, and those suffering chronic diseases. Entire towns, as we know, have been destroyed. This is not just a US trend, it's a global trend. We saw it in Australia in what was called a black summer. They had 46 million acres burned, 33 people died. 1 billion animals are believed to have perished, including about a third of all koala bears. The Arctic is now the home of what have been called zombie fires. That is, they're covered up by snow in the winter. As the snow dissipates in the late spring and summer months, those fires are still there and reemerge. And a paper submitted, I believe, to the scientific journal Nature showed that Brazil is shifting by their continued wildfires to being a net absorber of carbon dioxide, to being a net emitter of carbon dioxide. The next element, the next climate flashpoint, is ice melt. And we're not talking just on land. This has been well documented in terms of glaciers. But you might remember the February heat wave in Antarctica. 20% of the seasonal snowmelt occurred in just 5 days. And in the Arctic, the sea ice melting has increased 70% over the last 35 years. It's not now simply melting from above, from contact with a very warm atmosphere, but also from below by the warming sea surface temperatures in the Arctic Ocean. The last flashpoint is record CO2. Scientists measuring the level this past May, as they do in fact every year, recorded it at 417.2 parts per million. This is a new record. It might seem a little difficult to understand because as we were all sheltered in place, as we were all locked down, it was very clear the visibility was improving. Pollution levels were dropping. So how could this be? Well, in fact, as we know, there were great decreases in air travel, ground travel, and industrial activity. But essentially, those were more than offset by continued energy production. People had to have heating, and the increase in wildfire production. So I think that leads us to the question now of who or what is the culprit behind all of this? Is there one other than natural causes? So we turn to what we might call the scientific Sherlocks of a new field called attribution meteorology. So it's time to put on our detective hats. The search for fingerprints began in the year 2003, and that was the year of Europe's greatest heat wave since the year 1540. Now, outside of that being a very long time, to put that in perspective, I might ask you, can you guess who the King of England was in 1540, that last major heat wave? It was Henry VIII. In this one in 2003, tens of thousands of European residents died in that heat wave, and it's believed possibly as many as 2,003. So the question scientists wanted to ask is, were there human fingerprints? What was assembled was an international detective agency of scientists. World Weather Attribution is the name of it. It was made up by the leading researchers in climate science and a variety of other complementary disciplines in England, the United States, France, and also the Netherlands. What they were looking at specifically were 6 different types of extreme weather: extreme temperatures, rainfall, floods, drought, snowfall, and storm surges, the sort that we see associated with hurricanes or tropical storms. So their question, and the scientists were very careful in framing this accurately, the question is not whether climate change caused a specific extreme event, but did it make it more likely, and did it make it more intense? Okay, here's what they found out. That 2003 European heat wave, it made it twice as likely. The 2019-2020 Australian heat wave, what they called Black Summer, and then the resulting fires, 10 times as likely. 2019 tropical storm Imelda in Texas, which dumped 43 inches of rain, twice as likely. And the Siberian heat wave and the fires that we've seen ensue up in that area this past year, 600 times as likely. Now that's the website, Siberian or worldweatherattribution.org. It has more information on all of these research projects that have been peer reviewed by independent agencies, and also some other situations that are believed to have been made more likely and more intense because of human-caused climate change. So I believe the strength of this evidence brings us to do very straightforward questions. Why is there continued debate, and why has there been so little action? I might share a story with you that I heard a little while ago, and it struck me that might be applicable to this. And that is, let's say it's a cold day, you jump in your car, you're checking the messages on your cell phone, which we never do when we first jump back in our car. And we're breathing out, so we notice our windshield is frosting up. We take out a rag or we take out a scraper and we scrape off some of that frost. And we go back to our email messages. We notice the frost is building up again. So again, we wipe it off. We go through this several times and we're getting frustrated. Now, finally, our passenger looks at us and said, why don't you simply turn the car on and put the defroster to work? The basic assumptions that we were using in terms of what we had to do to make that frost go away had to change, just as the basic assumptions we're putting into play in terms of countering this warming of our atmosphere, the oceans, the land also need to change. So let's address this issue of why the doubt. It's because there is a climate of denial and also a climate of distraction. Laudato Si, I think, speaks very well, as it does so often, to the very real conflict between financial interests, science, and ultimately the common good. Now, I will be the first one to say that we've had to review some very disturbing information in terms of the extent, the severity of climate change, in terms of how this is being attributed to humans. And I have to admit, when I read research papers, I can feel my blood pressure begin to rise. So let's take a slow, deep, and easy breath and move at least to a lighter approach, courtesy of the cartooning skills of Dr. John Cook of the George Mason University College of Climate Change Communication. He's a very skilled cartoonist, and he was kind in allowing me to use some of these cartoons, at least to give us a little bit lighter touch. So the 5 techniques of science denial include fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. Let's approach each of these in turn. So the first one is that of fake experts that are trotted out and at least assert that they can counter the prevailing science. An example is this letter that was sent to the United Nations. 500 scientists, or what were purported to be 500 scientists, who stated there is no climate emergency. Well, what happens is some climate scientists began to look at the signatories of this particular document and realized that only 4 of the 504 actually had degrees in meteorology. Dozens were fossil fuel company employees. And an example of one skeptic who we picture here, many were scientists, engineers, or others who admitted to never having read peer-reviewed climate research or having ever attended climate science conferences. So they didn't have the background, and their own assertions were never subjected to peer review. I think a fair example is that it would be a little bit like having an expert eye surgeon try to do a root canal, or an expert dental surgeon try to do eye surgery. We need to have them stick with their particular specialties. The fact is, 97.4% of all climate scientists who are published in the field agree that we are causing global warming. The next technique of science denial is that of logical fallacies. For example, you may have heard a commentator say, well, it's just a theory. Well, this shows a misunderstanding of science. For a theory is not a guess. It's not just some vague idea. A hypothesis is a guess. A theory is a hypothesis that's been proven independently to have successfully explained a range of phenomena over the past, confirmed by present observations and by a variety of other scientific institutions. Let's take a look at what theories actually are. One is the theory of quantum mechanics that has given us medical PET scans, a very important medical diagnostic tool. The other is the general theory of relativity, which has made GPS possible. And of course, this theory, the theory of gravity, is an important one, at least I've found, to observe all of the time. The next technique of science denial is number 3, is that of impossible expectations. It goes along this line. And Climate Clock, by the way, is an excellent website to check the change in global warming and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It says that, well, we've only had slightly more than 1.1 degrees centigrade of warming. That would be about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. How can that possibly cause the severe, the severe instances that we've seen of changes in the atmosphere and in the ocean? That would be a little bit like somebody dropping a couple of drops of arsenic in drinking water and say, go ahead, you can drink this. This is going to be safe. It only has a trace amount. It doesn't take much to begin to cause serious changes. Another that falls into this idea of impossible expectations is somebody saying the reason the climate is changing is it's always been changing. Well, it's true, it has been changing, but what is significant is the rapidity with which it's changed and the intensity with which it's changed. This is a graphic put together based on World Meteorological Organization data beginning in 1850, and watch how it changes. You'll notice that, initially, let's see if I triggered it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. That seems, okay, now it's going. You notice in the 1850s, we're getting very little change, That is true in the Roaring Twenties, World War I, World War II, the Korean War era, even the Vietnam War era. We don't start really seeing a major change in temperatures until the late 1980s to 1990s, and you saw how it's expanded. Now, I'd like to give this a little bit of perspective. We like to say that a full life would be 80, 90, 100 years. I just lost my mother this past summer at the age of 93. We celebrated her life as being extraordinarily full and a great gift to all of us, and certainly to her. If someone begins aging very rapidly in their preteen or teen years, and in fact dies by, say, their mid teens to late teens, we would consider that a real tragedy. That's the disease of progeria, accelerated aging. We would look for ways to prevent it or at least to slow its progression. I think, in a very real sense, what we're witnessing, as you saw on that graphic, is the rapid warming of the atmosphere, the land, and the oceans of our planet are essentially progeria of the planet. Well, let's move to the technique of science denial number 4, and that is that of cherry picking. You've heard this before, somebody saying, it's cold, so therefore global warming can't exist. That would be similar to saying, it's dark, as we might tonight, therefore the sun can't exist. Now, I do think this is deserving of a little deeper exploration. February 2019 in Seattle, I remember this, I had to get out and shovel a lot of snow. Record snow, more than 20 inches, and it was unusually cold. And it was, to be very honest, not just in the Pacific Northwest, up and down the West Coast, the Rocky Mountain states, the North Central states as well. So could this have disproved the idea of global climate change? We need to use a telescope instead of a microscope. Understand that our country is big, 3.8 million square miles, but compare it to the surface area of the globe, 197 million square miles. And the US, we find, only covers 2% of the planet's surface. And the area impacted by that extreme cold and snow was less than 1% of the planet's surface. We have to look for the general trends, not the occasional exceptions. The atmosphere, after all, and our weather patterns attempt to moderate and offset given changes in the atmosphere. And so it's expected that you're going to be getting some of these variations. The last technique of science denial is that of conspiracy theories. And as these other 4 techniques have been countered and disproven, we see more and more shifting to that. Social scientists tell us that increasingly, conspiracy theorists are hijacking climate change concepts on YouTube. Not only on YouTube, but also Facebook and Twitter, and even to an extent on Instagram. An example of an agency that has been using that to spread disinformation is the Heartland Institute. I received many mailings from them, and I looked at the purported science and saw that it had not been peer-reviewed and tended to be based on some real fallacies. What was interesting, and this does not say, by the way, Die Heartland Lobby, it's not an expression of opinion, but it was published in a German magazine because a team of German reporters sought to investigate leads that the US Heartland Institute was working with climate change deniers in Germany in 2019 to undermine climate protection measures. 2 of these reporters went undercover just last December. They had little pens with video cameras in them and microphones, and they were posing as public relations representatives for the German automotive and fossil fuel energy sectors, and claimed that they were looking for donation opportunities. They expressed the goals of what they wanted from Heartland to be to end strong climate and environmental protection laws, to support diesel instead of electric cars, and to support coal instead of wind or solar energy. After having heard this, James Taylor, no relation, by the way, to the singer, who serves as the chief strategist for the Heartland Institute, told them that Heartland would, if they got enough money, call attention in published papers to the minimal health impacts of diesel engines and coal-fired power plants. When I say published, this meant printed papers, not those actually subjected and reviewed in peer review process. And he also promised that the donations linking these scientific papers, or what were purported to be scientific papers, to the industries would be kept a secret. So I think the maximum this brings out for us is to follow the science and to also follow the money. Now, I am giving you this talk today, and we're going to converse later on, not merely as an atmospheric scientist or as a science journalist, but as a committed Catholic Christian, one whose faith is very important to me. And so that is the thing that calls me forth to do these particular presentations. Laudato Si makes the point that some committed and prayerful Christians, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment, claiming it is at best a secondary or a tertiary concern for Christians and for us Catholics in particular. In the view of St. Francis and in the view of Pope Francis, the word neighbor does not simply apply to those who live near us or even occupy the planet at the same time, but also those who will be occupying this planet well after us. And it was that encyclical that drew me to Rome in September, I believe it was, of 2015, to meet the original editor of the encyclical, Father Michael Czerny, who is now Cardinal Michael Czerny. And I'd like you to meet him right now. Peter's successor, Pope Francis, is seeking to literally upend attitudes toward climate change by writing this new book called an encyclical, Laudato Si. The Pope has repeatedly emphasized the environmental crisis represents a crisis of faith and reverence. Laudato Si. The words mean praise be to you. The letter released this past May emphasizes the problems and the need for action extend far beyond current generations. While visiting Rome earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak with Father Michael Czerny. He led the team that composed the first draft and offered insights on its motivation.
One is the scientific evidence, and the other is the experience and the suffering of the poor. And looked at from these two complementary angles, climate change is on the agenda.
On the assertion that humans have a right to use the Earth's resources however they wish.
And God doesn't exercise dominion rapaciously or irresponsibly. In fact, he does it very lovingly. And so it's a mistake to use the word dominion as a justification for the uncontrolled or the unmeasured exploitation of resources.
On the issue of waste and overconsumption.
When it becomes a kind of tranquilizer or antidote to unhappiness, then again, it's not serving its real purpose.
On criticism by some that the Pope, a trained chemist, should be silent on climate change issues.
There where important decisions are made, that is where one's faith, one's values, one's character, one's vocation, one's destiny are played out. I think that's a pretty good definition of religion, and I think that's where religion has its contribution to make.
Other churches, other faiths, have expressed similar perspectives and concerns. And I would like to thank King TV for allowing me to use that as a matter of fact. These concepts, these teachings are not novel. They hardly constitute departures from standard Christian, Catholic thought and teaching. As Pope Paul VI pointed out, due to an ill-considered exploitation of nature, humanity runs the risk of destroying it and becoming in turn a victim of this degradation. Pope John Paul II, an avid outdoorsman and hiker, in his catechesis issued in January of 2001, called for a global ecological conversion. He issued a warning to humans who saw the natural environment only as a source for immediate personal use and gratification. Pope Benedict XVI, sometimes referred to as the Green Pope, talked of the Word of God as being the constituent of both the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And he said, the book of nature is one and indivisible. Creation is harmed where we have the final word, where everything is simply our property, and we use it for ourselves alone. The misuse of nature begins when we no longer see any higher instance than ourselves, when we no longer see anything else but ourselves. So Pope Francis built on the teachings of his three predecessors, and his encyclical team did as well, on Jewish scripture, which we often call the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Gospels, and scientific discoveries and knowledge. And at the foundation of this, inspired by the preaching, the teaching, and the fidelity to a life led by the gospel of St. Francis of Assisi, who was the original inspiration for this. The Franciscan theologian Dan Haran points out, we no longer believe the sun rotates around us, but some still believe the rest of creation does. And I look at this, and I think it's important to again use this as an example why we can't just end at Genesis 1 and the statement of dominion, but move on to the statements in Genesis 2, the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament in informing our opinion and our views of this and our motivations. I had to take a lot of math as an atmospheric science student, and I would say that I think just looking at Genesis chapter 1 is a little bit like if I had taken a math class, done the exercises in chapter 1, closed the book, not gone to class anymore, and expected that I'd ace the finals. I can tell you that would not have happened. And right now, by dint of the evidence of what we're seeing in the globe around us, we are not acing the finals in terms of how well we're caring for the gift given to us, our planet, the gift from God. It's clear that some are suffering, and I think Catholic social teaching asks us to explore the question, are some suffering more than others? It calls out specifically in Laudato Si, the gravest of all effects of attacks on the environment are typically suffered by the poorest. So this speaks to the issue of environmental justice. As we look at this, I think it's important to understand that the impact of heat and pollution on health is not simply a matter of numbers. It's a matter of faces and families and also individual stories. And I'm going to just slide the sound back because the lady in this video has a voice that projects quite well. It's another visit to the allergist for 11-year-old Zoe Zola. Both Zoe and her 5-year-old brother Ollie suffer from asthma.
Have you felt like you've been sick lately?
Dr. Frank Ferrant is Zoe's doctor.
There's a lot of evidence over the last 20 years that we are seeing more patients with asthma.
And more of those patients, like Zoe and her brother, are related.
I'm going to have you open your mouth real wide. Say, ah.
The reasons for the increase can be found inside and outside our bodies. The blueprint for life within our cells, in our genes, is redrawn when we breathe polluted air. We become more likely to develop asthma.
If you have inflammation in any part of your body, but in this case in your lungs, and you don't reduce the inflammation either by avoiding the exposures or, of course, treating it, over time, the airway can create thickening that isn't so reversible.
Physicians like Dr. Ferrant call this change remodeling. The image to the left is a healthy lung. The image to the right, a remodeled lung. So moving on with this line of inquiry, heat directly impacts asthma, adult and childhood, heart disease, and stroke. And it amplifies the impact of pollution on asthma, heart disease, and stroke, certain cancers, kidney disease, and even diabetes. Now, it turns out, I think a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences shows an interesting aspect of all of this and why it is an example of environmental injustice. Those who consume the least tend to suffer the most, that is, lower income Americans, and especially those of racial and ethnic minorities. The question I think we're left asking is why? And an investigative series in the New York Times that was done in cooperation with the city governments of a variety of locations around the United States gives us some important clues. Specifically, it focuses on the historic pattern of redlining, a bank practice, particularly back in the 30s and 40s, that analyzed neighborhoods in order to avoid offering mortgage loans to areas that were considered risky. The city officials in a number of locations, including Richmond, Virginia, began to investigate the long-term impact of that practice, even though it had been abandoned years ago. Here's such an historical map indicating parts of Richmond that were considered at the time to be declining or hazardous for loans. Those are colored, as you can see on the screen, as yellow or red. When we compare those areas with public health records documenting the incidence of adult asthma, lung disease, heart disease, we see a very strong match, either in neighborhoods that have historically been occupied by lower income groups, the red and the yellow, or those that have been more recently occupied due to the process of gentrification. Now, if we take that one step further, we'll see that because of that historical pattern, because of the predominant chance of pre-existing heart disease, lung disease, asthma, the incidence of severe COVID symptoms is much higher in those areas or actual COVID deaths. Now, a study published by Harvard University this past spring began to look for the connection between these different problems, that is, long-term exposure to air pollution and COVID-19 mortality, and they found there was a very definite fit. I think, again, the question is why? And the question that is answered by returning to the Richmond, Virginia study is that they were tending to be located closer to major highways, 4 lanes or greater, and as a result, be subjected to more pollution, higher heat, and have fewer trees to filter out the pollution or to help shade them from the heat. Now, I did a little investigating and I found that there was a similar red line map available for the city of Seattle. So as a result, I decided to go on a little drive, and I'd invite you to go along with me. Understand that major thoroughfares, such as Interstate 5 that I'm driving on right now, both absorb and re-radiate more heat than areas simply covered with soil or turf or vegetation. And they're also subject to much higher levels of air pollutants, things such as carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, benzene, particulate matters, each of which is tied to health impacts. So we're going to check the connection between income level, pavement, trees, and heat right here in Seattle. This first neighborhood has been considered desirable for decades. You'll see plenty of trees, big trees here, and it's several miles away from the nearest highway or interstate. So let's check the temperature right here in Queen Anne. There we are. We're looking at 75 degrees. Now we're heading to a neighborhood that was long subject to redlining. It's called the Georgetown neighborhood. Many of the people living here live near or even below the poverty level. You'll find plenty of pavement. You won't find many trees. So let's check the temperature here. 82 degrees. That's 7 degrees warmer than in Queen Anne. Now that's exactly what the published research showed, that in city after city, low-income neighborhoods tended to experience temperatures 5 to 20 degrees hotter than high-income neighborhoods. Now, this is a problem that knows absolutely no borders. The loss of cropland, homes, and increased infectious disease from either drought or the intrusion of salt water that ends up sterilizing the soil and making it unsuitable for agricultural use is expected to generate more climate change refugees, what are sometimes called eco-migrants, probably 200 million more at minimum by the year 2050, about 30 years from now. I think when we speak, as Laudato Si points out, when we speak of thou shalt not kill, 20% of the world's population consuming resources at a rate which robs poor nations and future generations of what they need to survive, it needs to be examined more carefully. As Laudato Si also brings up, and I think this is a very important follow, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who will come after us, to the children now growing up? This deals with the issue of what's either been called climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. And I first heard this just last year. I was taping an edition of our television program, Challenge 2.0. We were looking at confronting the issue of youth stress and suicide. Some of you may remember this as being the new generation of a program that was initiated by Father William Tracy, who many of you know, and Rabbi Raphael Levine. As we were doing the interview, one of the panelists, who is a trained crisis intervention counselor, and we were talking about stress, I posed the question to her that what are the biggest sources of stress that she hears from young people, expecting it might be peer pressure, parental pressure, grades, social media. She told me one of the biggest sources of stress I hear from teenagers is climate change. They wonder if they will have a future. Now that was a shock. This phenomenon goes by several different names: eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, earth grief. And those are now stressing this current generation. Just to offer a few of their reactions, Levi Draheim of Florida says, "I fear I won't have a home here in Florida in the future." Kayla Breathwaite of North Carolina says, "I'm going to have to be scared for the rest of my life." And finally, Jamie Margolin, who is from right here in Washington State, says it's really hard to grow up on a planet full of ifs. These are concerns echoed by young people all around our country, all 50 states, and all around the globe. Now, as it once studied the anxiety of young people regarding the potential for nuclear war back in the 50s and 60s, the American Psychological Association has now analyzed the impact of climate change. It reports a chronic fear of environmental doom is among the biggest, if not the biggest, source of stress for young people today. The study links such fear with increased panic attacks, sleep disorders, substance abuse, depression, aggression, and even suicide. Now, this may stem from either experience losses or disasters or ones that are simply anticipated. The effect is basically the same. I understand these impacts, by the way, from my own personal experience. When Mount St. Helens erupted catastrophically 40 years ago, my job ended up changing. It expanded from science reporting, and yes, that's me there, to locating victims, including the driver of this car, a Datsun B210, who I found was located mere yards from my final broadcast and campsite that I had occupied just literally hours before the eruption. He died from the intense heat of that 600-degree blast, which melted parts of his car. You can see those just above the bumper. Such deeply disturbing encounters, ones I didn't ask for, certainly didn't desire, paired with the near brushes of death that I experienced before, during, and after the eruption, they change you, they redefine you, they transform your interior emotional landscape. And I think that was only enhanced by a sense of vulnerability when I looked at the extent of devastation, which destroyed 234 square miles of Southwest Washington. Well, I would say that as I've studied the impact of climate and eco-anxiety, I recognize some of the symptoms that I experienced back then are the same ones that young people and adults are experiencing as a result of climate or eco-anxiety today. And I will emphasize how we respond can make a major difference. Now, I'd invite you to join me in a brief experiment. Take whatever hand you tend to write with or use most frequently, push the fingers together, including your thumb, cup it, put it over your nose and mouth, and as you prepare to breathe, squeeze in on your nostrils with your little finger and your thumb and press, and try to take a breath. Okay, move it away. Now take a breath. It's much easier, isn't it? Now let's do the identical thing. Get ready to move that hand over your nose and mouth, but before you breathe, move your head back just an inch and breathe. It's much easier, isn't it? Now notice you didn't do anything to change the problem, not yet, but you recognized it and you changed your response. And that is an important first step. So let's look at some effective techniques that we can use. I like to call these techniques the 5 E's, one for each of our fingers. This is my take based on what counselors are now recommending and based on my own experience. As I reviewed these, by the way, embracing your emotions, exploring your emotions, expressing your emotions, engaging your challenge, and re-energizing yourself, I recognized an interesting similarity to an ancient practice of our faith developed to help us explore, absorb, and apply the Word of God to heal and to deepen us. It's called Lectio Divina, and it was developed by the Desert Fathers and Mothers of our church back in the 3rd and 4th century. One version, called Lectio on Life, applies the practice to our personal life to help us explore and absorb the lessons of our experience of our life and to grow from them. They are Lectio, read or recognize, equivalent to your feelings; meditatio, to reflect; oratio, to pray; contemplatio, to rest. And a 5th step was added by the theologian Hugh of St. Victor in the 11th and 12th century. That is operatio, putting your prayer or discernment into action. Now, I will admit to flipping the order of 4 and 5 because I thought that that would help us in order of addressing the particular challenges of climate and eco-anxiety. So let's move on to step 1. It's embrace. Per Lectio, read and recognize your emotion. We are called to identify and embrace, not to ignore our emotions. They are a natural part of our survival instinct. They help alert us to the fact that something we care about is at risk, motivate us to take action. Suppressing emotions simply creates further stress and can impact our very immune system. Putting our feelings into words helps us move the action away from the flight and fright part of our brain to a point where we can take definable and successful action. It allows us to respond more successfully. Let me offer words that inspire me at such times. Let it be done to me as you say, said by Mary in her Magnificat. And Jesus, not my will, but thy will be done. This reminds us that there's the movement of spirit within us, and we have a bigger foundation to rest upon. And as Jesus also reminds us, be not afraid. As you pause to explore your emotions, begin to give yourself an outlet to express them, to name them. There's a saying, if you name them, your feelings, you can tame them, and you can ask for help and for guidance then. The word pray comes from the French verb prière, which means to ask for. To frame that request for guidance, seek and discern what your emotions tell you that you care about. What places, what parts of creation, what problems? This is step 3. So what we're going to do is actively engage in prayer, both active, asking for guidance, and silence, giving the Spirit an opportunity to provide inspiration and answers. And there are different ways to do this. For me, prayer is the first step, but other ways of allowing Spirit to pray through us can come through journaling, through music, through sketching, a variety of other constructive approaches. Each is a response to the Spirit, if you will, moving within you, hovering over the, if you will, the deep waters of your personal self. The key question to answer is how the emotions that emerge through this active engagement reveal what you most care about. The answer, the what to that question, leads us to step 4, and that is to engage our challenge, to take action and to connect with others who care. And this is so important to become part of community. It reminds us that we're not alone. It's part of the reason we gather for Mass on Sundays. I like to suggest that there are 5 different outlets that we can use to turn eco-anxiety into eco-hope and healing. The first is give your money. The second is to give your voice through writing, through calling, or through petitioning. The next one is give your attention. That is by learning more about the challenge and how you can most successfully respond to it. Give your engagement through connecting and working with others. Connecting is a key. It's deeply empowering, and it builds on efforts of others. And finally, give your energy by imagining and then creating the world that you want to experience. As you give your energy, keep in mind some of the insights of neuroscientists. They tell us that when we get really upset, or when we really upset others through perhaps attack or shaming or ridicule, the fight or flight portion of our brain, something called the amygdala, it's colored here, takes command and robs a brain of its ability to react, to think things through in a way that it can learn or to change. It's called amygdala hijacking, and it's very counterproductive to the change you want. Pope Francis puts it very well. To be followers of Jesus today also embraces his teaching about nonviolence. I like the saying, lasting change moves at the speed of relationships. Seek always, and I try to do this, not always successfully, to establish a point of commonality, of relationship. You won't always succeed, but it's certainly an important first step to take. All of this is not easy. That's why we call it climate anxiety, eco-anxiety. And so it's important to take step number 5, re-energize, rest and be refreshed, as we learn in Lectio. Thomas Merton, who I draw a great deal of inspiration from, had this to say: the frenzy of the activist neutralizes one's work for peace. It destroys one's inner capacity of peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of one's work because it kills the roots of inner wisdom, which make work fruitful to begin with. And so there are several steps that I think are important to do. And you can tell that when you feel the stress building within you. Disengage. Give yourself some time out to just rest. Exercise. Physical exercise not only conditions the body, it has a very beneficial impact on the emotions as well and on the mind. Ground yourself in nature. More on this in just a second or two. And connect to places that you find rehabilitating, reassuring, that build you up, that help you feel peaceful. Such practices are required for the essential foundation of hope. I like to say hope is not a feeling, it's a practice. And I hope you don't view me as an Eeyore of sorts from relating all this information to you. Hope requires vision and effort. As the poet David Orr likes to say, hope is a verb with, as I've done, with their sleeves rolled up. You dance, you're going to expend some effort. Now, I mentioned the eruption of Mount St. Helens, the death, the absolute devastation that I witnessed, and it seemed that any recovery was impossible. Yet in time, life did return, at first the very small, and then the very large. Laudato Si makes the point, injustice is definitely not invincible. I would like to offer you 10 of my reasons for hope. I have many more than that, but we'll keep it to 10 so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers. Let's begin with these in turn. Reason number 1, the ozone hole. We've solved big environmental problems before. Scientists discovered the problem, they discovered the impact of the problem, and they discovered a way to solve it. Nations and people banded together and ended up taking the steps necessary to counter it. The ozone hole is now recovering. It's expected to be back to normal by 2050. Reason number 2, young people. If some of you are out there, know this is an existential threat. Adults, they sense, no longer have a monopoly on leadership, nor, speaking as an older adult, should we have a monopoly on leadership. Reason number 3 is voter engagement. 68% of voting age citizens want the government to do something to control climate change. And the issue public, those who feel this is an important issue to them personally, who vote, who contribute money, who take action, has nearly doubled from 15% in 2015 to 25% in 2020, this very year. Reason number 4, the involvement of faith groups, such as yours right there at St. Louise. All of these groups have faith leaders that are emphasizing part of the expression of their faith is to take care of our planet, and especially with respect to the issue of environmental injustice. Reason number 5, cities are taking the lead. 96 different cities, representing 1/12 of all the people living on our globe, are banding together to share solutions, and they are showing a major impact. We're seeing this on a regional basis as well. In fact, over this area that's shown by this regional greenhouse gas initiative, greenhouse gases through a variety of different strategies, since 2009, the use of greenhouse gases has been more than halved. Reason number 7, business recognition of the opportunities of renewables, but also of the cost of not action. Insurance actuaries, these are the people that determine risk and also calculate the premiums we pay, rated climate change the number 1 threat to their industry, ahead of economic instability, cyber terrorism, or regular terrorism. And I would also point out reason number 8 is job growth. 2 of the fastest growing areas in our economy are wind energy and solar energy. And in fact, the number of jobs in renewable energy outnumbers those in fossil fuel jobs by 3 to 1. They tend to pay higher, and these jobs are emerging in all 50 states. Reason number 9, science, engineering, and innovation. The MIT fusion reactor just was rated feasible by other scientific groups other than MIT, and they're slated for a possible completion in 2025. Why is this important? Because it produces far more energy than is needed for the process of creating that energy. And Mark Jacobson, a highly regarded scientist and engineer at Stanford University, projects that we could reach 80% of net zero emissions by 2030 and 100% net zero emissions between the year 2040 and 2050. And finally, we are making a difference in means big and small. One charming way is urban pocket or microforest, where we do dense plantings over areas no bigger than a tennis court that absorbs. It's making a definable impact on absorbing CO2, filtering out pollution, and reducing urban temperatures. So this leads us to the final question, I think, or group of questions. What can we do? This would be, I think, at best, a short-term solution. This was sent to me on a 100-degree day in Seattle by one of our viewers when I was doing television weather. I think we have 4 questions to answer. What should I do? How can I find the answers? Who can I team with to help? And how can I keep heart? Number 1, what should I do? I like to say live smart, eat smart, shop smart, and move smart. And those are on the handouts that I think Katie has made available to you. We've heard reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle is important, but I think we need to focus more on reducing, especially looking at what we're consuming. Just with the aspect of eating, if we end up eating less meat, especially red meat, get our food products closer to home, not processed, and that are produced sustainably, we can make a major impact on this. And of course, continue to look for ways to reuse and recycle objects as well. As Pope Francis likes to point out in Laudato Si, purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act. Recognize every purchase is a vote for how it's been produced, sustainably or not, how the people who work for the producer have been treated in terms of their employment, and how that producer relates to the nearby environment. Descartes said in one of his maxims, "I think, therefore I am." It seems all too often we operate by a variant of that. I consume, therefore I am. And the idea that whatever the purchase might be, that happiness is just another purchase away. I think all of us know the fallacy of that. It is possible to even have a definable impact on our travel, be it ground travel or air travel, through the use of carbon offsets and certification. Cooleffect.org, and I've put the website on there, can give you access to different ways of offsetting the carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that are produced when you travel. Greenee.org and goldstandard.org are ways of certifying these to show that they really do work. It can be everything from planting forests, preserving forests, changes in technology for even third world countries so they use less open fires and use very efficient stoves. How can I find the answers? There are a variety of good groups, NASA, NOAA from the federal government, variety of universities. One that I'm familiar with, I served on the advisory panel, was Climate Matters, and all of these are available and listed in the handouts that you can access yourself. And of course, it's important to find objective news sources of science and climate information, ones that employ science literate reporters, writers, and producers. I have a number of friends that work for the Seattle Times in the environmental and science areas. They're excellent journalists and have a sound understanding. The New York Times publishes a weekly newsletter on science and also climate. Who can I team with to help? We talked about the importance of this in terms of our psychological well-being, having a sense we're not alone. There are certainly different groups that you can contribute to or begin to work with. One thing I do is when I'm considering who I'm going to work with or who I'm going to contribute to, I go to Charity Navigator. I've got the website at the bottom of this slide to see if most of the money I contribute is being used to achieve the end they're seeking, as opposed to overhead. You're looking for those that have 4 stars. I recommend that highly. And then see what moves you personally. The ocean environment has long been a passion of mine, and I work as a volunteer diver and conservation interpreter for the Seattle Aquarium. If you're ever down there and the voice behind the other side of the dome sounds familiar, it might be me back there. I hope you'll visit. Finally, and I think this is important, is how can I keep heart? Spend time outdoors in nature. This is so critical. As Laudato points out, the world is not just something to be used, it's a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise for what it tells us about the Creator. The book Nature Fix, which I would highly recommend, contains research that shows unstructured time in nature, sometimes called ecotherapy, can demonstrably improve physical and emotional health. The recommended dosage, 2 to 3 hours per week. And that introduces us to the power of awe. A psychologist wrote just before the eclipse of 2017, you might have seen that right here in the Bellevue and Seattle area, that studies of people experiencing awe show that such people feel more compassionate, helpful, and generous. They feel less stressed and entitled, and they feel more connected, and we could all use that. To sum up, the call 800 years ago to Francis was go and repair my house, which as you see is falling into disrepair. The call now to us is to go and repair my house, God's house, our planet, which as you see with all the life support systems is indeed falling into disrepair. Francis, without question, provided us with inspiration with his life, his vision, his teaching that provided the foundation not only for Laudato Si, but also for the evolving recognition to view ourselves as part of a larger community of creation, a view with the potential to heal our crisis of meaning, our sense of estrangement. as we build on these examples of hope, not simply as a feeling, but as a practice. Remember that? Contemporary examples of those who have been exemplars of the necessary vision and the engagement can inspire us, true to the definition of that word, to literally breathe new life into us. I'd like to offer my friend Dr. David Johnston as such a source of inspiration. He was the geologist for the U.S. Geological Survey who helped me understand the essentials of volcanoes back in 1980, just prior to the eruption. When the volcano erupted at 8:32 that morning of May 18th, 1980, David called in the warning from his observation post just a couple of miles away from the volcano. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. Perhaps you've heard those words before. They were the very last words David ever spoke. The words that remain with me most are not those words, but I remember them. But words from David that he gave to his father, Tom, when I met with his dad just 2 months after David died at the eruption, when we got together at a small suburban Chicago coffee shop. I believe they provide inspiration, a sense of hope to meet the challenge that all of us face with the climate, with the larger environmental problems. David's father, Tom, told me, "Jeff, part of me wishes I'd never encouraged David's interest in geology, but I couldn't have done that." He used to say to me, and say to me more than once, "Dad, each day for me is a new opportunity to learn something new, to get better at what you do, and to use that knowledge and that skill to help others." I keep on my desk the small bottle of ash that I collected from the crater of Mount St. Helens to remind me of David, to remind me of his philosophy, and to remind me of the challenge that I believe that poses to me, as well as a foundation for hope. It's easy to feel that by ourselves, we simply aren't enough to meet those challenges. I'd leave you with the last thought then. If you think you're too small to be effective, you have never been in bed with a mosquito. Fortunately, we're beyond mosquito season, I believe, but I think we all know what that's talking about. I'm going to unshare my video, and I think Katie is going to jump back on here.
Yes. And just go ahead and maybe take a breath there, Jeff. That was extraordinary. So I'm getting messages about just how content rich and helpful your presentation was. So thank you so much for that. So folks, I'm getting some questions about a recording. I am in fact recording it. I didn't start recording it till about a minute after Jeff started talking. So it'll be missing that first minute or so. But I am, Jeff has given his permission for us to record this. So as long as we are, if you know, you're looking at it, you're remembering the date, if you send it to a friend, just make sure it's sent with that date. And again, it's copyrighted, so not selling it or profiting off it or anything like that. But for your own private education, there was, I know I will be watching this recording again because there was a lot of content in the last hour. So just to answer that question.
Katie, I would just interject if you missed that first minute. And of course, that's the problem when all of a sudden I had some a throat spasm there of sorts. I'd be happy to re-record that. You could just edit that together.
Perfect. That sounds good. That sounds good. There are folks in the parish who are much better at tech things that will help me with that, I'm sure. Okay, so we have a question. This is from our wonderful Kaya, who works with a lot of our youth. She does especially liturgical formation with our youth at our Life Team Mass. And this Kaya, I have this question too. She asks, why do so many Christians feel it is Christian to deny climate change? And how do we communicate with those folks in a way that doesn't make them defensive?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's one that leads to some consternation in me. I think there are several parts to that question, really. I think there is the perception that those that care about climate change somehow don't care about some of the issues that are very important to us as Catholics. Some don't, but I will speak to you that there are many that do. I'm one of them. A member of the National Academy of Sciences, I was honored to be invited back to his installation in Washington, D.C. Dr. Dennis Hartman is one of the lead climate scientists in the world, and he teaches at the University of Washington. So I think that sense that if we're with them on this issue, we have to be with them on all the other issues simply is not true. The scientific information and the evidence is very clear. In fact, at the point where we are in terms of understanding climate change, we are farther along than doctors were in understanding the impact of smoking on lung cancer. So the science is solid. I think what we need to do is get a sense of when we talk about pro-life, and I like to consider myself as being pro-life. Pro-life, I think for most of us begins at that period of conception, but it doesn't stop at birth. It extends well after birth. And when we look at the impact in terms of pollution on people, when we look at those impacts in the environmental justice area in terms of chronic diseases that they develop, acute or chronic asthma, heart disease, lung disease, cancers. I was stunned when I saw that even exposure to greenhouse gases and pollution impacts diabetes, which we know is an epidemic in itself. We are talking about a lot of people that are suffering. We're talking about a lot of people that are dying and suffering economic limitations and despair as a result of that also. So I think we need to take that full review, that full scope, and understand what the charge is to each of us. And I think also look back at not only Pope Francis, and I view him as very inspirational. I'm looking forward to reading his new encyclical, I believe it's called Fratelli Tutti, but also looking at the previous popes that have also made the very same point.
Absolutely. I would just add, just if I can just add a little bit to that, Jeff. Father Gary, who I think is still on, I'm not sure, he was having struggles with his computer, but Father Gary gave an incredible homily, I think about a month ago. I can find the link and send it to you guys on YouTube if you'd like, really connecting that, you know, all of these are life issues. So when and I admit it wasn't, I wasn't intentionally thinking of the election while we were, when we booked the date of this talk. It was just that the date worked, but when we're talking about what is a life issue, it is absolutely abortion, and it is also absolutely the death penalty, and it is hunger, and it is, you know, the ability to really live life in a way that promotes the flourishing of life. And so, of course, abortion has a special place in that conversation, but it isn't only abortion, and definitely caring for the environment, especially when we look at how much that will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable among us, especially the poor, definitely has to have a place. Cardinal Bernardine uses the image of the seamless garment. This is where we connect the seamless garment. So the environment is absolutely a piece of that.
If I can piggyback on that as well, Katie, and then go on. When I do a full presentation, and in fact, there's even a workshop on climate anxiety, one of the issues we look at is the field or the study of what's called epigenetics, and how two different things, emotional stresses and environmental stresses, can change the way our genes express themselves. Now, I'm not a medical professional, but this is, again, accepted science. And it shows that not only can those genetic changes lead to problems for people throughout their lifetime, but also their succeeding generations, their children, their grandchildren. So how we address this is not only impacting those that reside on this planet with us, but also those who are going to come long after us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. So we have another, this is more of a suggestion from Patsy. She's suggesting, as you were alluding to, Jeff, that we consider a plant-based diet. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit more. After years of research, she's found that animal agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. For example, up to 90% of the Amazon forest has been cleared to support animal agriculture. So I don't know if you wanted to expand on that.
I would just add, I think that's absolutely true. I know my wife and I are, we are not full vegetarians. We have swung so that a number of days out of the week, we eat strictly vegetarian entrees. The other thing I'd mentioned, and I wanted to make sure that I stayed within time and kept plenty of time for questions and answers, so this could be a dialogue. One of the elements is that the wildfires that we see over much of the United States this year is a worldwide problem. And there was a paper, I think, that was submitted and published in the very prestigious journal Science that showed that the Amazon, because of all the burning that's going on there to clear room for agriculture, particularly cattle, that they are expecting that they are going to change from a net absorber of CO2, greenhouse gases, to being a net emitter. That is, from being the lungs of the planet to essentially being an emphysema patient that ends up returning those noxious gases back to the atmosphere.
Absolutely. And I think Kaya has another follow-up to her initial question. She's asking, so this is, and Kaya, this is exactly the right question. So folks who are here, more than likely, I'm assuming, are probably on board with a lot of what Jeff is saying. So how do we talk to folks that maybe would be resistant to this, especially among our Catholic brothers and sisters? How do we approach folks in such a way that doesn't immediately put them on the defensive or become a political conversation? It's bigger than that. Do you have any advice for how to talk with family and friends about that?
It can be difficult. I'm going to be the first one to admit that. But I will say, I know when I've done other talks, there are people that you wish were there that could just be part of the dialogue that won't be. But what I say that I utilize is, number one, the power of story, the power of personal stories. That's why I include bits of video like that little girl and her brother that have asthma. If you can cite personal stories of how people have been adversely impacted by climate change, by pollution, that creates a sense of connection and sort of our natural ability to empathize that I think can sometimes reach across that. I talked a little bit, and Pope Francis has made a very strong point of nonviolent communication, that you start off attacking somebody's position, they're going to stiffen. As we say, we go back to that amygdala that ends up retarding the ability to respond and maybe consider change. If you question what their history is, what their concerns are, why they don't take that seriously, then you can respond to those. And you're not always going to succeed. We know just by looking at social media and the media in general, that positions are probably more polarized now than they have been perhaps since the 60s. But there are a lot of people that are not necessarily, that polarized. And I think if we can find ways, give them a chance to talk and then respond to that, I think we may have some success.
And I would just, so everything you just said, and I would also just say, we start from where we are connected. The Archbishop keeps talking about unity. That's a really big theme for him in the Year of the Eucharist, all the documents I've read. How do we start where we're connected and build from that? And yeah. Barbara Luxembourg has a question. She says, can you comment more on the situation in the Amazon and hope for the future there?
I think the Amazon is an example both of the heritage of colonialism, where native populations have been suppressed. We know that certainly in our own country and Canada as well. I think it's when where economic concerns are given primacy above those of personal health and personal dignity. I think it's also when a single issue dominates the discussion, because we know that the orientation of Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil, very much aligns with that. And so that they are facing the same issues that we are facing in the States, but I think in a way to an even more extreme basis. I would say that we see an opportunity for us to make a real impact, because a lot of the land that's being cleared down there right now is due to the wish of farmers to be able to ranch cattle for hamburgers. And so I think, if you reduce the amount of red meat you eat, if you, when you go to fast food restaurants, a lot of them are doing some very wonderful work in terms of documenting, okay, we're using vegetarian products, veggie burgers, or where they source their meat from. I think the most powerful thing you can do is let them know, write them letters. And just as it's important to go ahead and protest to different groups that you are not going to give them your business for a given reason because of actions that you don't find acceptable, when you find somebody that is taking action that you believe supports your basic core values, go ahead and let them know that as well, because I think there are people that are maybe struggling within those corporations saying this is the direction we need to go, and there are others saying, well, no, we don't really need to do that, or you're being silly and wasting money on that. If they can point to letters that come in from people saying, I'm giving my business to you because of this, that can make a real difference. But as I mentioned earlier, there are studies indicating that, we just get a drink of water here. There are studies that have been published and peer reviewed that suggest that the Amazon basin is going to change from being a net absorber of CO2 to being a net emitter. And so that's why it's a very serious situation. And it isn't just Brazil. We see it in other countries in the in what's called sometimes Amazonia of northern South America, and in other tropical regions around the world.
Absolutely. From Mary Curtis, she wanted to just make sure there was a deep sense of appreciation for this presentation. So thank you on behalf of the whole community, but from Mary. George Sonyo is asking, and yeah, absolutely. So he's leaving a comment that says, Jesus said, love of God and love of neighbor as yourself, but those are really the commandments, right? So this is deep in Catholic teaching. I really appreciate, Jeff, that you pointed out that Laudato Si was not novel, that it was building on all the encyclicals and all of the teaching that has come before it. So thank you, George, for those scriptural roots. Sherry wanted to mention that Jeff is doing this same talk. Are you doing the same talk next week?
The talk that I'm doing next week is related to it. It's specifically on the issue of climate anxiety, but we delve into it more deeply. We wanted to give all the aspects of this, and this issue of climate anxiety is emerging, I think it could be said, exploding so rapidly that I wanted to make sure that was in for that. But I'm also doing a workshop, if you will, on climate anxiety. It's going to be, I think, 2 hours, and it's through the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. And I don't know if you have the link. I could send that to you. You'd certainly be invited to be welcome to take a part of that. And we're going to explore this in greater depth. And also, there are going to be some breakout groups where you have an opportunity to sort of build on some of this. And we are looking at, because this is fairly new, I'm looking at building more extensive presentations, both on what we did today, but also that one, to get together to talk out things and to be able to engage on some possible solutions. I suspect you'll be able to walk forth from this today with some ideas, and that's why I wanted to put those handouts for you, but it's an opportunity to delve more deeply into this.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And the registration is on the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace website as well, Sherry mentioned. Father Gary Zender, who is still with us, yay, in the chats, he says, who himself, I've worked here 2.5 years now, has a deep personal commitment to this issue. I've seen it in real life. Father Gary Zender says, any comment on the use of plastics, not using plastic straws and toothbrushes? And he mentioned that he just bought a bamboo toothbrush last week. Yay, Father Gary, that's great.
I've got to work on my dentist. Maybe we both need to walk in and talk to my dentist, Father Gary. That is a very deeply personal issue for me. As I mentioned, I'm a volunteer diver for the Seattle Aquarium. And one of the things that we really make a point of is the issue of plastics in the environment. There was a study done that each of us, because of the breakdown of plastics into microplastics and the prevalence of microplastics in a variety of products, clothing, other things, is that we end up getting it through the water. We end up getting it through the air. They've detected microplastics in the snows in the highest ranges of the Rockies. They've developed it or found it in the North Pole. I'm not sure about the Antarctic. I wouldn't want to say something that I haven't seen definite documentation. But essentially, each week, we end up absorbing the equivalent of a credit card-sized volume of plastics in our body.
Really?
And we know that plastics are what they call hormone disruptors. They disrupt the normal functioning of our bodies. In some ways, we know reproduction, normal expression of hormones that help our body functions proceed as they are supposed to. But that's a very serious issue. So I'd say, as much as we can get away from the use of plastics, recycling certainly helps. You see the little symbol on the bottom. And I think they're beginning to find, I know at the aquarium, we have in the cafeteria, different products that are used from plant-based plastics. And I think that's going to become an increasing area. But I would certainly agree with you, Father Gary. The more we can get away from using plastics, the healthier we will all be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's so hard, right? Because it's like, what isn't? I watched a documentary about plastics a few months ago, and it's like, what isn't plastic in my life? It's like everything is plastic. It's hard. But as much as we can, and I think that gets to your point, Jeff, about yes, recycle, but focus more on reducing consumption. That to the degree to which we reduce consumption might help with that.
Yeah.
George has another question. He says, would you want to comment on the rising sea level as an effect, and what do you see as a cause?
That's one thing that I like to do in talks. I didn't in this one, and it was a tough one to leave out. But what I will say is that some areas are going to be affected more by sea level rises than others. The Pacific Northwest, and it speaks of deep time, geologic time, because of the retreat of glaciers, the landform of the Pacific Northwest is still rising. And as a result, even though the sea level is rising, it's going to be slower to impact this area. Research simulations suggest that we're going to be seeing several key areas of impact. One is going to be along the Duwamish. One is down around Commencement Bay. And the other one is around Port Gardner, leading into Everett, all the way up to the city of Snohomish. The initial projection, and this was considered to be an extreme projection by the end of the century, but we're seeing everything developing much more rapidly than was expected, in part because scientists were saying they were meeting such headwinds, such opposition, they sort of scaled back a little bit. The areas that are seeing probably more rapid development of this is along the East Coast, along the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, the state of Louisiana has set aside $50 billion to do a 50-year study of how they can prepare for the intrusion of the coastline. And there are entire communities that have existed for a century or more on fishing, shell fishing, and that sort of thing that are going to be disappearing. We had, I believe it's the Quileute tribe here along our own coast because of erosion that is having to relocate if they haven't already done so. So this is a very real sense. And as the sea level rises, there are two effects. There's the visible one where, the seawater intrudes farther inland, but there's also the issue where it penetrates below ground surface and it penetrates into aquifers and areas of drinking water, and they're no longer useful for drinking because it's salt water, it's not fresh water. So that's a very good point also, George.
Mm-hmm. I have other questions about the Paris Climate Accord and the difference between individual and general, but I also want to be respectful of folks' time. So maybe we can just encourage, in the chat, I put the link to the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace event for Jeff next weekend. So if there are follow-up questions, maybe that would be a good place to go. But Jeff, just again, a huge thank you. I wasn't kidding when I said I'm going to be watching this recording myself because there was so much content and it was really, really helpful. I really especially appreciated the places for hope and the things we can do. This is not a done deal. So
no, it is not.
Yeah,
no,
that's wonderful. Father Gary, I think I made you a panelist again, and I'm wondering if you are there and would like to lead us in closing prayer.
I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
All right. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of beauty and God of truth, everything in your creation is connected. And for all who share a common origin in your creating hand, fill us with a spirit of praise, gratitude, wisdom, and courage, that we might care for creation and not misuse it. Ensure that its goods are shared in justice with all our brothers and sisters, and speak out on its behalf whenever it is threatened. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, thank you again. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I will be sending a link to the recording of this talk later today. Thank you again, Jeff.
Excellent, thank you.
Jeff.
Katie, I've got a question for you later once we send everybody off. And I would say if you get some more questions and want to just type those up and send those to me, I'd be glad to go ahead and type up a response to those as
Okay.
well.
So if you guys have questions, just send them to me and I'll get them to Jeff.
Jeff, just also, I just want to say thank you so much. Just greatly appreciate what you had to share with us. God bless you.
Well, thank you for all you're doing there at St. Louis. I wish I was there to hear your homily from a couple of weeks ago that Katie mentioned, but
I'll send you the link.
thank you. Good, I'll watch that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Katie.